Good morning. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday study, Samuel to Chronicles. We're glad that you're here. We're in 2 Chronicles is where we're at, and we're in the second chapter of 2 Chronicles. Let me just show you the little chart that I always show people that I think helps us be able to see the historical value, or at least to be able to see kind of where things fit together. So Samuel started off with Samuel the prophet and his birth, and he became a priest and a prophet and a judge. And then Saul became king. And Saul was a good king for a little while, but then he gave into his jealousy and the fact that he was more of a men pleaser than he was a God pleaser. And he let the people often dictate to him what he was going to do instead of what God said. And so as a result of that, and by the way, the reason for that was because the children of Israel wanted a king after the nations. They wanted a king like the nations, and Saul was definitely a king like the nations. And that still goes on today. The kings of the nations, or that are popular with the nations, do what the people want them to do and don't necessarily do what's right. Often it's been said that the majority of the people are going to be wrong, and that it's not the majority of the people that make you right. And certainly that's true in many cases. And so that's the kind of rulers that we have today in our political system. They have to take a poll before they make a decision to figure out which way the people are leaning so that they can get voted in next year, because that's all they're concerned about, getting voted in. But anyway, so Saul was a man after God's own heart. And as a result of him disobeying God, God then decided that he was going to put his reign to an end. And so he anointed David. But during this time that David was anointed, remember, that's when the reign of Saul is declining and the reign of David is starting to become known. And so he has to go into exile because Saul is out to kill him. And that's basically Samuel chapter 1. And even though this is a study of Samuel and Chronicles, we notice that Chronicles doesn't really fit in with any connection with 1 Samuel, except for the very last chapter. And that's what we noticed last week and the week before. And so here's a chart for 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, notice here that David begins to increase in power up to chapter 11. We're in chapter 2 right now. And then David's going to sin. Remember the sin. Then his troubles are going to increase, and his reputation, you might say, might wane a little bit. And then we're going to have some statements that are made at the end here in the last 3 chapters. But he's going to be reigning over Judah. And David reigned 7 years in Hebron. And then David reigned 33 years in Jerusalem. And so together, David reigned 40 years. But this gives you a little overview of the book of 2 Samuel. And of course, since 2 Samuel deals more with some of the things that Chronicles deals with, we have a little highlight in the story of Chronicles, although it really doesn't come into play until like about chapter 10 of 2 Samuel. There's a little bit of information. But basically, the very first part of the book of Chronicles that I went over with you real quickly was an introductory material with the genealogies of the tribes and the patriarchal period. And then you had the national period. And then in about chapter 10, we get ready to have the story about David. And that's where those stories match up with the death of Saul. And so Chronicles picks it up there. And so that's where we find together. And that's why here you have David's rise. And so even though it started talking about David in Chronicles, it's really not going to mesh much with 2 Samuel until we see David start to increase a little bit more. Then the two will come in play with each other. And we'll try to cover those together if we can without being too confusing as we do that. Now, the other chart I want to show you, since we're getting into the Kings, I like this chart also that comes from Jensen's, the same as the other group. And this Jensen's chart is a chart of the kings. And so here at the top, you have the kings of Judah. And here at the bottom, you have the kings of, up here at the top, you have the kings of Israel, which are the 10 northern tribes. And down here, you have the kings of Judah, the 2 southern tribes. But during this time, during this period here, before it's divided, we have what's called the United Kingdom. And Saul was the first king of the United Kingdom, and then David, and that's the story that we're at now. And then we're going to get Solomon. And then from Solomon, that's when the kingdom's going to split. And so this chart is really useful for seeing who's ruling at which time, and also which of the prophets are prophesying during that time. And so we'll be looking at this chart and also the sister chart to it, the second half of it right there. We'll be looking at that as we get more into the kings themselves and the two kingdoms, Saul and Israel and Judah, when they're divided after Solomon. They get united. Right now they're divided because David and Saul Saul has looked at David as an enemy. And so it's going to be divided right now, but God is going to cause it to come together as one group. And that's called the United Kingdom period. And during that period, you have David, who's going to be the king. And we see now how he's going to gain control of Israel. And then his son Solomon will be the next king. And it's after that we get the divided kingdom. But that's what I want to show you here in these charts. And like I said, I'll be showing you that more and more as we go through here. So as we get ready to look at 2 Samuel chapter 2, I want to remind you that as we do that in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we heard of the death of Saul. When it says the heard of the death of Saul, David wasn't there because he wasn't in the battle, if you remember. He wasn't fighting for Israel. He wasn't fighting against Israel. He went back to Ziklag and he had to deliver his people because they had been taken by the Amalekites, if I remember right. And that's when they found this fellow who from the Amalekites said that he had killed Saul and taken his crown. And remember that story. And he thought he was doing David a favor because he thought Saul was David's enemy. And even though Saul was an enemy of David, or Saul considered David an enemy, David did not consider Saul an enemy. And we see that verified for us as David writes this lament in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And so that's where we ended up last week with looking at this lament that David had, that in fact indicated his great love for Saul, even though Saul was out to kill him. And what that illustrates for us, it illustrates the idea that God says we're supposed to love our enemies. So David didn't want Saul dead. And remember, he had a couple opportunities to do that. And even when Saul died and David knew that he was going to be the king, he still wasn't pleased that Saul died. And so I believe David is a good attitude or a good example of the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount that we're supposed to love our enemies. And so that's what you see here with David. And that's important because I think that helps us understand the unity that David is able to promote in a couple of years as his reign starts. And so we're going to pick it up in 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1. And here's what it says. It says, then it came about afterwards, that's after David learned about the death of Saul and after his lament. It says, then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. So David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the city of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. And David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul, your Lord, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I also will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. And so the very first thing that we see here, as we notice with David, and that is certainly something that we all should practice, is when David has a major decision to make, he inquires of the Lord and talks to the Lord about it. And though God might not answer us in exactly the same way he answered David, because back then in that time they had the priests and the Urim and the Thummim, and the priests were a go-between, even though we might not get a direct revelation like David did, it's certainly a good thing to pray to the Lord, and the Lord will help us and direct us. And I really believe that he can direct us in the course that we need to go as we make decisions according to what we know his word wants us to do. And that's certainly a difference between David at this point and us. And that is that at this point, David wasn't sure of this decision because there's no place in the scriptures that said, David, after you defeat Saul, you know, go to Hebron. So he had to inquire and he had to figure out where to go. And so God talked with him and spoke to him. And certainly this is an example of Jesus, who's our king, and God speaks to our king, and then our king directs us. And if we're following God, then we will follow the king that he's appointed for us, and we will do whatever that king has asked us to do, because we know that that will comes from the Father. But it's a good example. It's a good example for us to pray when we get ready to make an important decision. And so that's what you have going on here. And so it says, then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the reason he asked that is because he's been living in the Philistines for over a year, I believe, and he's been living there, and he hasn't been fighting against Judah, but he hasn't been really fighting against the Philistines themselves, but he has been fighting against those remnants of the Canaanites that are in the land. And occasionally he might fight with a Philistine city, but when he does, he makes sure and kills everybody so nobody knows. But the point is that David had not been living in Judah for a while, and so therefore he thought it best to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord told him that he could go up, and David said, well, where should he go in Judah? And the Lord said to Hebron. So Hebron becomes his headquarters for the next 7 years, becomes his headquarters. And it says in verse 2, so David went up there with his 2 wives also, Ahinoam, the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Now you remember who Abigail is, but Ahinoam, we don't really know a whole lot about, other than that she was a Jezreelite. But one of the things this also shows us is that David, though he was a man after God's own heart, had multiple wives. And sometimes people say, well, God said they could. Well, God never said they could. God permitted it. God said, if you do take a wife, another wife, then there's certain rules and certain regulations you have to follow. But just because he said that doesn't necessarily mean that he wanted people to take more than one wife. But nonetheless, God is working with people and with David. And so he's working with David, and he understands who we are. And so he works with us in our faults and in our difficulties. Because you remember when Jesus was asked, is it lawful to put away your wife for any reason, in Matthew 19:9 and I believe Mark 9, that basically what he said was, go all the way back to the Garden of Eden and look, and you'll notice that God made one man and one woman. That's what God made. That was God's intention. So it never has been God's intention for people to have more than one wife. Now, God, knowing the hearts of men, know that they're going to do that. And so God legislated exactly how they were supposed to do that. And they weren't supposed to favor one over the other. And if the second wife happened to be the one you loved the best and she had a child, you weren't supposed to take away the rights of the firstborn from your first wife because you like the second wife better. And so God set up some rules and regulations about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God sanctioned that arrangement, or that God, wanted them to have more than one wife, but he did. And so it says in verse 3, and David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the city of Hebron. So they're making their headquarters in Hebron, and he goes up with his family, and all of his men go up with him. And so that shows you their loyalty, because now that they're kind of accepted in Judah, they could go wherever they want, but they end up staying with David because they realized that David was going to be the next king, and certainly they understood that God was with him. Now in verse 4 it says, then the men of Judah came, and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. Now, as we read this, the reason that this is important is because we understand that God had already anointed David as king over Israel. And even though that's true, each group really needs to affirm that, that they need to recognize that God made him king over them. And so that they need to accept him. Now, the other interesting thing is we don't know how many people knew that David had been appointed king. We know that some people did, because we know that Abigail did. When Abigail came to talk to David, she told David that you're going to be the king. God has made you king. So the information was out there. How prevalent it was, we're not sure. But I would assume that everybody understood, or at least those people that were in the know, they would understand that David was and had been anointed king and was going to be king after Saul. And even Jonathan knew that God had appointed him king, if you remember. And so that the information was out there. And so probably what this is showing us is that Judah was the first to accept the appointment of God. And, that's also an illustration of Jesus. God has made Jesus king of the world. I know there's some who have the idea that the kingdom of God isn't here yet, but those are individuals who look at the kingdom of God as a physical thing instead of as a spiritual kingdom. That's why Jesus, when he was talking with Pilate, said, my kingdom is out of this world. And that's the reason why Pilate and Herod didn't put him to death. Because if Jesus' kingdom was in competition with Caesar, they would have had to put Jesus to death. But they understood that Jesus' kingdom was not in competition with the present system, because it wasn't that kind of a kingdom. And therefore, they weren't going to kill Jesus just because the high priests were jealous. And they did end up killing him, but that's because the chief priest threatened them that if Pilate didn't kill him, that they would tell Caesar that he let a king go. And that's the reason that he killed him. But in the meantime, he wanted to let him go. Now, the reason I say all that is because that's what's going on here. God made David king over Israel, but each of the people need to accept David as king. And so here we see the first tribe accepting Jesus. And that's even true in the tribes. Judah might have accepted King David as king, but there might be people in Judah who don't accept David as king. And so it's something that each person has to accept on their own. But what we're going to start to see is we're going to start to see how David develops with the kingdom, and how the kingdom is slowly coming around to understanding that God has anointed him king and accepting the anointment of God's king. And so that's what you have here. And so that's why it says, then the men of Judah came and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now, we don't know how long that happened after David went to go live in Hebron. It doesn't exactly tell us, and I don't think there's any place that it does, but I don't remember everything. And so that's what I want you to understand. It says, and they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. And so remember that David had written that lament about Saul. And so everybody knew that even though Saul had looked at David as his enemy, that David didn't. And so when David became king, they wanted to tell David about the good deed that Jabesh Gilead had done for Saul. And remember, Jabesh Gilead was that group of people that Saul first went over and delivered out of the hands of their enemies. I believe it was the Amalekites, I think. But anyway, it was one of those countries that begins with A. I know that for sure. And so verse 5 says, and David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord and have buried him. Now, notice that it says that David sends messengers, and these messengers bring the message that says, may the Lord bless you and show you kindness because of what you did for Saul your Lord. So he appreciated their allegiance to the fact that Saul had been king and that they had buried him. And so David was really appreciative of that. And again, what that shows you is that David wasn't just lamenting Saul for the purpose of making a show in order to get people to believe that he really liked Saul, but he's doing it because that was actually his heart. And so it says, verse 6, now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. In other words, David is saying that he's going to be gracious to them like they were gracious to Saul. And so because they delivered Saul, then he's being gracious to them, just like the opposite of that Amalekite man that was found and said that he had killed Saul, and so David killed him. Well, this is the opposite of that. That individual, said that he killed Saul. These individuals are trying to honor Saul, and so David is going to honor them because they're honoring Saul. And again, that shows you David's heart and his attitude. And so verse 7 says, now therefore, let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul, your Lord, is dead. And also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. And so basically what David is saying is that he appreciates their loyalty to Saul, but now Saul has died. And so their loyalty needs to be shifted. And he hopes that their loyalty will be shifted to him because Judah has made him king. And so that's why you have that little discussion there, because they were loyal to Saul because of what Saul had done for them. And David knew that if they were that loyal to Saul, then they would be loyal to him if he could get them on his side. And now verse 8 says, but Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, even over all Israel. And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. And so what we have here then is we have the fact that as the war ended, the Philistines had gone and fought against Israel. They killed Saul. And so now Israel was without a king. And so you have Abner, who is the commander of Saul's army. And so Abner, needs to figure out how to keep Israel in rule, or under a government, or lead them. And so it says that Abner, the son of Ner, by the way, as pointed out here, he's the commander of Saul's army. So he's the one that led the army. His counterpart in Judah would be Joab. Joab is the commander of David's army. We're going to notice that a little bit later on. But Abner's the commander of Saul's army, and he took Ishbosheth, that's one of Saul's sons, and brought him to Mahanaim, and made him king. And so basically what he's doing is he's trying to put somebody in a position of power so the people will have a figurehead and follow him. Although Ishbosheth wasn't a very good ruler or leader, he was, you might say he was a weak leader, and maybe he learned that from Saul. Who knows? Because Saul wasn't the greatest of leaders either. Saul was, especially in his older, in his latter years, he was fearful and timid about David and trying to kill him and everything. And so maybe Ishbosheth learned it from him. But anyway, Ishbosheth wasn't a very good king during the time he ruled. It was more Abner who was in control of things, and Ishbosheth was basically the headpiece, you might say. Now in verse 9 it says, and he made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, even all of Israel. So basically Abner made Ishbosheth king over everything except Judah, because Judah decided to follow David. And so there is this period where David, you might say, has to win over the children of Israel in order for them to follow him. But remember that David hadn't really been around much. He'd been in the country of the Philistines hiding, and Saul had been out to kill him. And when the battle came that caused their king to die, David was nowhere to be found as far as helping Israel defeat the Philistines, which of course they didn't, and they lost. And so there might be some I can't think of the word, some reason for them not to want to immediately follow David, some uncertainties because they weren't quite sure of David. And so I suggest to you that that's what's going on here. So Abner makes Ishbosheth king and anoints him king. Now the other thing is that this anointing of Ishbosheth doesn't necessarily happen immediately after Saul dies, but it probably happens a little bit of time afterwards. And the reason I say that is because some other writings have in it the fact that that there's a chronology, and the chronology is, well, down here, the chronology is that there's a little bit difference in the length of time that Ishbosheth rules and David rules at the same time. And there's a little, discrepancy. And the discrepancy is probably that Ishbosheth didn't become king until a little bit later on, as Abner's probably trying to find somebody, or as maybe Abner notices that the nation, the 11 tribes are maybe being a little discouraged, or maybe they're clamoring for a king or whatever. But anyway, when he does appoint somebody king, it is Ishbosheth. Now, verse 9 says, he made him king over Gilead and basically all of Israel. Verse 10, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. So he's king for 2 years, but David is king for 7 years in Hebron. And so this is, as you read on, this is where some of the chronologies might be a little difficult to try to figure out, although it's not impossible. And it says, in the house of Judah, however, followed David. So Judah's following David, and the northern tribes, everything above Judah, is following Ishbosheth. It says in verse 11, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So that's how long he was just in Hebron when he began to rule. Now, in verse 12, as a result of these two kings, you now have Abner, who is trying to get Ishbosheth in power, and you have David, who's in power of Judah, and the kingdom is supposed to be one nation, one group, and so now there's this civil war that's going on. Just like in our history, we had a civil war. The South, the North and the South, we had this civil war where we fought against each other. Well, that's basically what you have going on here. And so you're going to have this war, because that's generally the way, kingdoms are conquered is by one's army. And if you have the better army, then you conquer the other government and destroy it, and then you get to rule over them. And so that's what you're going to have going down here. As we read, we're going to have the wars that resulted as a result of this civil war, and the stories behind those. And so let's start at verse 12. It says, now, Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. And then Abner said to Joab, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. And Joab said, let them arise. So they arose and went over by count, 12 from Benjamin, and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. Each one of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so that they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called Hilkath Hezurim, which is in Gibeon. And that day the battle was very severe, and Abner, the men of Israel, were beaten before the servants of David. Now I want to stop there, or at least read that far down, and see what's going on here, because this is a rather strange little story, and we kind of look at it and go, wow, they're really morbid people. But I think there's something that we're missing in here that might make it seem a little bit more palatable. Verse 12 says, now Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. In other words, what it's saying is that Ishbosheth took his army to go out and fight against Judah in order to try to unite the country, because that's what they're trying to do. Verse 13 says, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servant of David went out to meet them by the pool of Gibeon. And so there was this pool, this famous pool, and I believe it's still there. And they sat there. So you had one army on one side of the pool, had the other army on the other side of the pool. And just like they usually did, they would line up in ranks before they get ready to fight. And so that's what they're doing. And so it says when they sat down, in other words, they're sitting opposite each other, and one on one side and the other on the other side of the pool. And so they're in talking distance, you might say. Now, verse 14 says, then Abner said to Joab, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. And Joab said, let them arise. Now, let me suggest to you that, we use the word contest here, but it's really not so much like a contest. It's more the idea of competing. And you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, in a contest, you do something to win a prize. In competing, you're trying to defeat the other person. And that's what you have going on here. It's kind of like when David beat Goliath. Remember that Goliath was in the valley between the two armies, and he was defying the Israelites, and he was saying, send out your champion. And if your champion comes out and beats me, then we'll be your slaves. But if I beat your champion, then you'll be our slaves. Now, the reason they would do that is because it would save a lot of lives. I mean, nobody wants to go out in a war and fight. And so the idea was that these men were going to send out their best fighters, and the army basically, or the fighter who would win, would then, control the outcome of the war. And they could spare a lot of lives, and they could, keep people from that, because they're fighting their relatives, they're fighting their neighbors, and, people that they probably know. And so that's never good. It's like our Civil War, it was like brother against brother sometimes. And that's not very good. So they were trying to figure out a more, if I can put it this way, humane way of deciding the victory and the outcome of the war. Well, let's see what happened. So it says, so they arose and went out by count, 12 from Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. Now, I don't believe that they went out, 12 guys lined up all at once. I believe what you have is you have the top 12 guys. And so you have the first two guys that go out and fight and they kill each other. Then the next two guys go out and fight and they kill each other. And the next two guys go, and so it goes all the way down to 12. It goes down to the 12, groups, because there's 12 tribes in Israel. And there's no decision that's made. And that's what you see in verse 16 says, and each one of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called Helkath Hazurium. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe we can get a definition over here for us. It means that is the field of strong men. And so that's basically what it became known as. It became known as the field of strong men, or the field of champions, you might say, because the champions of each army met there and they fell and died. Now, since that didn't work and one side didn't beat the other side, the war starts. They start fighting with each other. And verse 17 says, that day, the battle was very severe. And Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So Israel is defeated. Now, when it says Israel is defeated, that doesn't mean that Israel's just all of a sudden give up and come over and be with David. It just means that David proved that his kingdom, his rule, is of sufficient strength to occupy his territory. And that's basically what that is proving when his army beats up Ishbosheth's army. And so therefore, that's what you have going on here. So Israel isn't going to all of a sudden just give up and go, okay, you guys won. But the idea is that they're not going to be fighting against Judah, because they recognize that David has a strong rule and a strong reign that he's not going to give up. Now, verse 18 says, now the three sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. And Asahel was swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. And Ahithophel pursued Abner and did not turn to the right or to the left from following Abner. And then Abner looked behind him and said, is that you, Asahel? And he answered, it is I. So Abner said to him, turn to your right or to your left, and take hold of one of the young men for yourself, and take for yourself his spoil. But Ahithophel was not willing to turn aside from following him. Abner repeated again to Ahithophel, Asahel, sorry. turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab? However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the belly with the butt of the end of his sword, of his spear, so that the spear came out his back. And he fell there and died on the spot. And it came about that all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which is in front of Gaiah, by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. And the sons of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became one band, and they stood on the top of a certain hill. And then Abner called to Joab and said, shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers? And Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. And so let's stop there at verse 28 as we see the fight that's going on here. Now, as this fight is going on, recognize or remember that, like I told you, that you'd be fighting against people that you know. And Joab had, verse 18 says, Zariah had 3 sons, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And we know who Joab is. He's the commander of the army. And Asahel and Asahel and Abishai are his brothers. And it says, and Asahel was swift of foot. In other words, he could run really fast. So he was, he was like a gazelle, it says here. And Asahel began to pursue Abner. Now remember, there's a war going on. There's battle. People are fighting as this is going on. And so, if you've ever seen those movies where you have 2 groups fighting, and then you have, somebody maybe the star in the movie, you see him running to fight against the main opponent in the other battle. But while he's going, he has to fight these little skirmishes on the side in order to get there. And that's basically what's going on here. Asahel is pursuing Abner, and and making a beeline for Abner, and Abner sees him coming. And so basically, when he turns around, he says, is that you, Asahel? And Asahel says, yes, it is. So you see, he knew him. He knew who he was. And so Abner said to him, turn aside to the right, to the left, in verse 21, and take hold of the young men for yourself, and take for yourself his spoil. And so basically what Abner's saying is, look, fight against one of these other guys and kill him. And then you can take his spoil home, and you can go home as a victor, because you spoiled one of the enemy, and you can take his property, because that's what you were allowed to do when you killed somebody. You were allowed to spoil them and take what belonged to them. And so that's what Abner's trying to do. Abner's trying to talk him out. And the reason he's trying to talk him out is because he says, down here in verse 22, he says, Abner repeated again to Asahel, turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab? And so even though there's this war going on, they still have, feelings. And if you have somebody on the other side that you consider a good that you respect, you might say, especially, a soldier that you respect and him personally, that certainly you wouldn't want to hurt any of his family, because then that would put this strain between you and that other individual. And so that's basically what Abner's saying. Abner's saying to Asahel, look, if I kill you, then how in the world am I going to be able to deal with your brother? Because he's going to see me as being the one who always killed his brother. But Asahel wouldn't listen. Verse 23 says, however, he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the belly with the butt butt end of the spear, so that the spear came out at his back. So he basically, as Asahel was probably running towards him and Abner was facing away from him, that as Abner heard Asahel coming closer, he just took his spear and thrust it back, and happened to, perforate Asahel. And not only that, but it went all the way through him and stuck out on the other side. So that kind of gives you an idea of probably how fast Ahithophel was running towards him, and the force that it took in order for that to happen. And it also tells you that Abner wasn't really facing Asahel and didn't really want to fight against him. But even if he did kill him, it wasn't a time of war. And so it's not considered murder. It's not considered revenge. It's considered you died in battle. And, if you died, it just means you lost. And that's all that it meant. And nobody went out to find vengeance against the person who killed you in a battle. Or at least they weren't supposed to, because everybody understood that that's certainly, if I can put it this way, a legal way to be killed without being accused of being a murderer. And so that's what you have going on here. And so it says, and he fell there and died on the spot. And it came about that all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. So there's Asahel, they all know who he is, and there he is dead, and there's spear sticking through him. And so they all come and they just stop. They're just kind of appalled at what's going on. And so one of the things that tells us is that even in war, men can be appalled at the stuff that they see going on, and can be mournful about the things that are going on, even though they might have to do them and they have to participate in those things. And so in verse 24, it says, but Joab and Abishai, that's his other brother, pursued Abner. And when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which is in the front of Giah, by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. So they're getting Abner's armies going back home to Gibeah, where they're from, but Joab is still pursuing him with his brother and the army. And so it says in verse 25, and the sons of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became one band, and they stood at the top of a certain hill. And so basically what happens is everybody rallies around Joab as they're, about to enter into their own territory. And so they certainly don't want Joab to enter into the territory. So everybody comes around Abner, and it says in verse 26, and then Abner called to Joab and said, shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers? And so basically what he's saying is, look, you guys have won. We're defeated. We're leaving. So why in the world are you still chasing us? If you keep chasing us, it's going to turn out bad. More people are going to die. Basically, he's saying, we know you won. We're going back home. We're not going to bother you anymore. It's kind of the attitude that he's telling them, but you're still chasing us. And so why are you doing that? Well, we're entering our own territory. You guys ruled Judah, but we're entering into our territory, and you're still coming after us. You guys need to stop. And so verse 27 says, and Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. And Abner and his men then went through the Arabah all night. So they crossed the Jordan, walked all morning, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab returned from following Abner. When he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants, besides Asahel, were missing. But the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. And they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And then Joab and his men went all night until dawn, until the day dawned, at Hebron. And so basically what you have then is you have each army retreating as they speak about these, about surrendering, you might say. And so that's what verse 27 is about. When he said, Joab says, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother. In other words, he says, we would have been fighting all night if you hadn't said anything. But instead of fighting all night, then, we'll go ahead and blow the trumpet. And so verse 28, that's what you see happening here. In verse 28, they blow the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. So basically what that did was that established the boundaries of each person's reign. David's reign was going to be in Judah, and Ishbosheth's reign was going to be from Benjamin all the way up, the rest of Israel, basically, because they had been following Saul, who was king. And so Ishbosheth is the king. And so they're basically staying loyal to their dynasty, you might say. And then it says in verse 29, and Abner and his men went through the Arabah all that night. So they crossed the Jordan, walked all morning, and came to Mahanaim. And so basically they finally get to their headquarters where the king's at, and they get there defeated, but they walk all night. And verse 30 says, and Joab returned from following Abner. When he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants besides Ahithophel were missing. So there was 20 people who died in David's army, and one of them was Asahel. And there was 360 men of Benjamin who died, or Abner's men. And so they were soundly defeated, you might say. And then verse 32 says, and they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which is in Bethlehem. And then Joab and his men went all night until the day dawned at Hebron. So they go back to their home camp, where they then will be able to go back to David and report the battle. And so that's what you have in chapter 2. Now, as we get into chapter 3, we begin to notice some problems that are happening in Israel under Ishbosheth's rule, which cause some difficulties. But before then, we're going to notice the family line of David. And so notice what we have here. This is 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Ammon by Ahinoam, the Jezreelite. His second was Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. The third was Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggath. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by David's wife, Iglah. These were born to David in Hebron. And so basically there you see the family of David up to this time that happens in Hebron. So these are the individuals that are born to him in Hebron. And there were six, he had six men born in Hebron to him. And it could be, and we're not sure, that he had other children too, but because they seem to mention just one for each one of his wives. And so it's possible that they're just mentioning the firstborn of each wife, which would have you might say, a right to the throne in case David died. And that might be the reason why we only have one mention in each one. Or it could be that David just had six and that was all he had. But we know that later on he's going to marry again because he's going to marry Bathsheba and have Saul and another son, Solomon, and another son as well. But I just want you to notice that he's listing the sons that he has there. And so it's probably, even though if verse 1 says that there was this war, it was probably a time more of peace than it was of war. And the skirmishes were probably small and weren't real significant each and of themselves, But in each skirmish, David was getting stronger and gaining more control, and Abner was losing, or Ishbosheth was losing. Now, verse 6 says, it came about while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now, Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Iha, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone in to my father's concubine? Then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hands of David, and yet today you charge me with a guilt concerning the woman? May God do so to Abner, and more also, if as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. And he could no longer answer Abner a word because he was afraid of him. So I want to stop and look at these verses here down to verse 11. Now, beginning in verse 6, after the names of his sons, it says, it came about that while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. In other words, Ishbosheth was a rather weak ruler. And rather than people looking up to Ishbosheth, they were looking up to Abner. And Abner was becoming more and more powerful. And so because of that, some people believe that this accusation that's made of Abner by Ishbosheth is true, where it says in verse 7, now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone into my father's concubine? Now, if Abner did go into his father's concubine, you might say, well, what's the big deal? His father's dead. Yes, but you have to understand that anything that belonged to the former king, if you took possession of it, basically you were making a claim to the throne. That's what you would be doing. You'd be making a claim to the throne. That's the reason why when Absalom, you remember, we haven't read it yet, but later on we're going to notice that Absalom rebels against David and kicks David out of Jerusalem and takes over the kingdom. That one of the things he does is he sleeps with David's concubines in public. And basically what that's saying is, I'm now in charge of your property. I'm now the guy in control. I'm ruling. And so that would be the statement that's being made here if Abner actually did this. I find it hard to believe that Abner would actually do this because Abner's character was highly loyal. Abner was loyal, and I would suspect that it's more a token of Ishbosheth's insecurity than it is of Abner's actual action. And that's why toward the end of this, in verse 8, he says, and today you charge me with guilt concerning the woman. In other words, in the Hebrew, it's more, you think I've made a fault in the woman. In other words, he's not saying that he did it. He's saying that you're charging me for doing it. And so basically what Abner's telling him is, look, I'm the only reason you're in power. I'm the only reason that you have a position. And so if I wanted to steal your position, I would have done it. That's basically what he's saying. I could have done it. I don't have to sleep with a concubine in order to get it. I can get it on my own. And I think that's really what Abner's saying here. When he says in verse 8, then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? In other words, the idea is that Ishbosheth is kind of claiming that Abner's going to work for David by becoming the next king, and that's what he's charging for. And so basically, Abner says, am I a traitor dog? Basically, is what he's saying. He says, today I show kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers and to his friends. and have not delivered you into the hands of David. In other words, Abner's saying the only reason that you haven't died is because I have chosen not to deliver you over to David. Because, Abner could have had a military coup and just killed Ishbosheth, or taken Ishbosheth, handed him over. And so that's why I think when he says, and yet today you charge me with the guilt concerning this woman. In other words, Abner saying, you really think I needed to go into this woman in order to gain power? Is that what you think? And I think that's what's going on. And now, as a result of that, notice that Abner doesn't say, well, I'm going to go ahead and take over the kingdom for myself. So apparently Abner had no ambitions of becoming the king, which is what he's being accused of, which is why I don't think that he actually slept with Saul's concubine. But it was a charge of Ishbosheth's insecurity. He says, may God do so to Abner and more also, if as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish this for him. In other words, Abner says to Ishbosheth, okay, fine. If that's the way you feel, then I'm going to go ahead and give the kingdom over to David, because God wanted David to have it anyway. So Abner knew that David was God's anointed. And so therefore, Abner's now going to, do God's will and take the kingdom and turn it over to David. And that's one of the reasons why I said that Ishbosheth is a rather weak king. He has all these insecurities. And basically Abner says, if I don't do this, then, God can basically kill me, he says. To transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul to the house, and to establish the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba. And basically he says, so since you don't appreciate what I've done for you, Abner's talking to Ishbosheth, since you don't appreciate what I've done to you, then I'm going to give the kingdom to David. And I'm going to turn the people over to David, because David's the rightful king anyway. And so verse 11 says, and he could no longer answer Abner a word, because he was afraid of him. So therefore, Abner and Ishbosheth were now on opposing sides now, because of the accusation that Ishbosheth had made against Abner. And so verse 12 says, then Abner sent messengers to David in his place, saying, whose is the land? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel over to you. And he said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing of you, namely, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me. And so basically what happens here in this section is that Abner says that I'm going to go ahead and turn the kingdom over to David. And so he says in verse 12 that Abner sent messengers to David in his place, and basically said, whose land is this? Make a covenant with me, and I'll make it your land. I'll give it to you. So that's how much power that Abner had, which is why it's kind of silly for Ishbosheth to accuse him of sleeping with Saul's concubine. Because if Abner wanted to take the power, he didn't have to do that. He could have just taken it. But he had been kind to Ishbosheth and to Saul's family. And so anyway, Abner says to David, make a covenant, make an agreement with me, and I'll turn the kingdom over to you. I'll bring all of Israel to you, make a covenant with me, and we'll do it together. And one of the things that this shows you is what a covenant is. A covenant is agreement you make with somebody for good. It's generally a covenant. You don't really use the word covenant for evil things, but for good, for peace, for peaceful activity. It's when you make a covenant. It might be more attuned to our word treaty. Okay, we're going to make a treaty with somebody. In other words, the war is going to end, and there's certain rights and certain conditions that are going to exist so that peace can ensue. And that's basically what you have here. This says, behold, my hand shall be with you, and to bring all Israel over to you. And he said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing of you, namely, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me. Now, if you remember who Michal was, it says she's Saul's daughter, but Michal is also the daughter that Saul promised to David if David would go out and get him 100 Philistine foreskins, if you remember. And so when David went out and did that, Saul got mad, and rather than giving Michal to David, for whom he had paid a dowry, and that's why it's a legal arrangement. See, it was a legal arrangement, and basically Saul took her and stole her after David had given him his dowry that he wanted, and having done so, would make it illegal for him to do what he was doing because she had been bought and paid for. And so David says, I'll be happy to speak with you about the covenants if you bring me my wife back. It's basically what David is saying, because she belonged to him. Now, it's also possible that David is doing this because Michal is Saul's daughter. And so therefore you would have, with Michal coming to David, you would have a union, you might say, of David and Saul. And so, it's kind of like in the stories that you see when two kingdoms are fighting, and then they decide that they're going to each give their children to each other for marriage. They're going to join their kingdoms together. And so they join them under the, now that they're related to each other because one king's son married the other king's daughter, or vice versa. And so therefore they become one family. And that's also what you might have going on here with this that's happening with Michal, because she's Saul's daughter, and therefore it would bring some unity to the union of Israel and Judah together. And so he says, unless you bring him, you won't see me. It says, so David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, to whom I was betrothed for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. And so Ishbosheth did this. Now, I don't know whether it was really Ishbosheth who did it, or that David basically, did it through Joab. And since Joab was Ishbosheth's commander, that whatever Joab did, it would be attributed to Ishbosheth. And so I think that's mainly what you have here, that Ishbosheth is he's just a token leader, basically. And so Abner is doing everything. And so because we see a little bit later here in verse 16, that then Abner said to him, so Abner went and actually did this, even though it was done in Ishbosheth's name. So verse 16 says, but her husband went with her, weeping as he went, and following her as far as Bahurim. And then Abner said to him, go, return. So he returned. And so basically Abner, went and fetched Michal in order to give her back to David, which was his legal right because he actually owned her, and he had never given her up. She's basically stolen from him. And so therefore he's getting his property back, even though she'd been together with this fellow Paltiel for a number of years. Now, verse 17. Well, actually, let's go ahead and stop there at verse 17 because our time is up. And I pray that God has blessed you for being here, and pray that you've learned some things about the history of God's people that help us understand how God deals with us. Pray God's richest blessings on you.